Okay, and then there are a couple other powers that the president has that I don't want to spend too much time on. I just sort of want to, so when I say I don't want to spend too much time on, the translation is this isn't going to be on the exam. So, but don't fast forward. Don't fast forward. Okay, so the other power, there's something on the screen there. Okay. I don't know if that's, okay, anyways. The other power that presidents have, two other powers that I want to talk about are first, the power to appoint officials, various officials. So the president can appoint ambassadors, Supreme Court justices, the heads of the various executive departments, the Department of Defense, the Department of State. But when most, not all, but most of the positions where the president can go ahead and appoint somebody, they have to be approved by the Senate. So once again, the president has the authority to go ahead, it has the power to appoint people, but it's checked once again by Congress. Again, the idea being that the president is supposed to basically, is not supposed to act unilaterally in a way. Congress is always supposed to be able to check the president. The framers are really concerned about executive power because of their experience with the king. The last power, and this is really more just interesting than anything else, is the president has the power to go ahead and pardon people. To go ahead and if you've been convicted of a crime, the president can go ahead and wipe out the crime, essentially, and say you're not guilty. And this happens periodically. When Richard Nixon resigned, he resigned after the whole Watergate ordeal came to light, and before he could go ahead and be charged with any crime, President Ford, who replaced him, pardoned him for any crimes associated with the Watergate scandal. So you couldn't even bring him to trial because it had already been determined that he was innocent, or that he was pardoned, he was excused. And presidents can do this, and no one can go ahead and check their power. Their power is uncheckable, for lack of a better word. And so that's important to keep in mind. But I'm not going to really test you on that. Next, I want to talk about the expansion of presidential power, although I do have something of a problem because it looks like my computer is dying. So we're actually going to go for a walk, and I'll continue talking. Yep, that's the way it's going to work. And hopefully it's not too noisy where we're going to go, where my plug is. So I want to talk a little bit about the expansion of presidential power. And I'm just going to discuss this briefly, starting with the 1800s, and then we'll work our way over to the more current times. And here we go. I'm trying to plug in. Hopefully we don't get interrupted. We'll have to see. Okay, new location, and now we're plugged in. Whoa, okay, sounds like people are outside, so hopefully you can't hear that. So in the 1800s, by the time we got to the end of the 1800s, more or less, the presidents behaved the way framers intended them to behave. I mean, they were sort of taking that backseat role. Not always, don't get me wrong, not always. There were certain times where presidents really exerted their power. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln certainly exerted a lot more power than the framers intended. Woodrow Wilson did. Theodore Roosevelt did. You don't need to remember these names if you're not familiar with them. But for the most part, presidents behaved the way the framers intended. They took the backseat role, which is what they envisioned, and in many ways, that's what the Constitution envisioned. But that wasn't me farting, that was me moving my seat. But in the 1900s, from the 1900s, presidential power starts to grow. Now, part of the reason that presidential power is starting to grow is because the United States is changing. For example, the economy of the United States is growing tremendously. We've moved into the industrial age, and we were once basically a farming economy. The United States was essentially dotted with a bunch of farms and then occasionally a city, but we were for the most part a farming community. But eventually, by the 1900s, we start to shift into being an industrial economy. We start to have big cities, okay, and that just requires the government getting more involved. And okay, so I'm a former plumber, so the way that this makes sense to me is to talk about human waste. Okay, sorry, human waste, but think about it. Actually, let me tell you about something. I saw this recently on TV about London. When London, England, was first becoming more and more populated, they didn't have ways to get rid of human waste, right? I mean, think about it. When you're on a farm, if you're getting rid of your own waste, what do? You go dig a hole in the backyard, and when somebody goes to the bathroom, you dump the bucket in the hole, and you keep doing that until the hole fills up, and then you dig another hole and you dump it in that hole. That's the reality. But now, once you have, in England, what they used to do is they had these guys who their job was at night, and I'm not making this up, so you can check me on this. Actually, there's no need. They would go ahead and they had these crews that would go, and people would actually leave their buildings when they went to the bathroom, and they would dump their waste into these big pits. And then at night, these guys would show up. I forgot what they were called, but they would go down these pits. So one guy would go down to the pit. Then there'd be another guy above the pit with a bucket, and he would lower the bucket down to the guy in the pit. And the guy at the bottom of the pit would scoop up the stuff. He would pull it up, and then he would go ahead and hand it to the guys, two other guys who were next to like a big, like a carriage, or like a big, it was on wheels, and you could dump it in and it wouldn't leak out. And then they would wheel it out of town and then dump it into whatever hole they wheeled into. And in the report they talk about kind of disgusting. So if you're eating something, put it down. They were talking about what would happen if the guy who was holding the bucket slipped. Disgusting. Anyways, when you have large cities all of a sudden, you've got millions of people going ahead and moving into cities. Hey, Nan, I'm recording. You guys, I'm recording right now, so can you guys just keep it down for a second, just till I finish this one?
Yes.
Okay? Okay, so once you start having large cities, then everything changes. Now you've got to go ahead and figure out a way to get rid of the human waste. Now you've got millions of people going to the bathroom. Millions of people are going to the bathroom, and you've got to figure out what to do with all that stuff. You can't just go around digging holes in the city and dumping stuff into it. So who's going to do that? Somebody's got to put in the sewers. Who's going to do it? Well, the government had to do it. Who's going to get water to the buildings? Well, the government had to do that. What about electricity? Who's going to do that? The government had to do it. And then bridges and all kinds of things. As society gets more developed, and we move from a rural economy to an industrial economy, the government got more and more involved because it had to. This isn't a question of like, is the government too big or is the government too small? This is just one of those cases where you needed to have more government. Also, back in the day when we were an agrarian society, if you needed food, but let's say you're on a farm and you're growing vegetables and you need food, well, what do? You go to the local store and you buy meat there, and hopefully it's not contaminated. But the federal government doesn't need to get involved. You're just buying in your local community. But once you have large cities, right, and what you have is now all of a sudden people are shipping food across state lines and into these cities, large trucks coming in or trains coming in with milk or with meat or with fruit, and all coming into the big cities, and you need somebody to go ahead and inspect that stuff to go ahead and make sure that it's going to be safe. And since it's crossing state lines, the federal government has to get involved. So part of the reason that the power of the president grew is because the responsibilities of the federal government started to increase. There was nothing that could be done about this. Now, there is a big debate over whether or not the federal government has gotten too big. And that's a long-standing and worthwhile debate about what the federal government should and shouldn't do. But what I'm talking about here are instances where the federal government had to grow. There was nothing that could be done. And because the president is sitting at the top of the federal government, as the responsibilities of the federal government grow, the power of the president grows as well. So part of that was sort of baked into the cake. It was something that had to be, that was bound to happen as our country changed. But there was something else going on as well, and we'll talk about that in the next clip when we talk about Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and what happened during the Great Depression and World War II, and that'll be in the Presidency 04.